Welcome to our second part of the podcast on democracy, migration and border studies, gaps and/or bridges, with Oliver Schmidtke, political scientist and director of the Center for Global Studies at the University of Victoria, Canada. For some people, migration studies and border studies appear also at the center of the so-called crisis of democracy and the rise of populist nationalist movements, as well as the return of sovereignism, as you said, Oliver, in the first part of our podcast. Traditionally, democracy includes the participation of the people in elections, political pluralism, a balance of powers, the respect for fundamental rights for citizens. Some politicians also see democratic systems as a means of obtaining the political power. Thinkers have distinguished an open democracy and a closed democracy to speak about the boundaries of a shared collective identity. Everything comes from this model of the nation-state and a national space. Oliver, my question is this one. How does migration studies examine these tensions between the boundaries of a shared collective identity and the foreign people?
So when we think about the implications for democracy, what migration scholars do, they look at the politics of migration and how the theme of people crossing international borders is being mobilized in narrations of who we are, national identity, and the ills of society that are manifold, and the sense of crisis that we are in. And borders play an important performative, symbolic role in the narration, in particular right-wing populists and their nationalist agenda. You briefly, referenced this when you talked about the return of the sovereigntist agenda. And, what we see is really, this sense of you can only be safe in the nation state. The outside world is chaotic, it's violent. And those, who have read a bit of political theory of Hobbes, they might be reminded of exactly this kind of fundamental narration of what, political power is all about, to keep us safe from, the war of every citizen against each other without the proper protection. It is about this bordered community where the supreme of the sovereignty rules. And that is now turned around and being used by populist forces to say, look, if we just close our borders, if we get rid of immigrants, all our problems will be solved. It's oversimplified, but a very powerful tool because you have easy scapegoats. You can come up with very simple policy solutions, right? As long as we close the borders, issues of economic crisis, of social unrest, of cultural conflicts, all this will magically go away. We all know that won't happen, but in a way, it is a powerful tool because it speaks to this fundamental sense of we are in a fundamental crisis at the moment, and we need to do something dramatic. And that is the narrative of these right-wing populists that challenge the rules-based democracy that you described. So the exclusionary nationalism that they stand for, to say the primary solution is to reestablish sovereignty. And you can go around Europe and see it's central to their their rhetoric. Orban, Marine Le Pen in France, it's always, I'm going to protect the sovereign right of our nation state, right? And so it goes. And then what does it mean? In an age of globalization where sovereignty is undermined by the flow of capital, of finances, of trade, it means protecting the borders, right? That is where this rhetoric has some, plausibility in terms of its narration, right? Because it becomes tangible. We know that the problems won't go away, and and you can't really make borders entirely impenetrable, particularly 1,000 of kilometers. But it makes for very good political publicity, and it is an emotionally charged theme that they use, right? It is about these outsiders that bring allegedly illnesses and crisis and cultural disruptions. As long as we keep them out, we will be safe. It is the sense of we are fundamentally existentially threatened is very powerful in politics, in particular when it becomes pretty boring, policies and so forth. So this reference to the borders by these nationalist populists has been a veritable challenge, to the vitality of our democracies and the whole project of European integration, which is so much based on creatively rethinking the exclusive sense of a national political community. Maybe there are other political communities we can diversify our democratic means and so forth. All this is being challenged with this kind of narrative.
Thank you, Oliver. Regarding this debate about democracy and the importance of democracy, for various reasons, some voters express a feeling of democratic dispossession. Difficult question, but we are here to ask them. Oliver, what are the links between the topic of borders and the academic research on democracy and the growth of nationalism and populism? I think it's not easy to understand very well all the links between these different topics.
Yeah, thank you for this question, Ben. I probably would need an hour to go over this. It's a very complex issue indeed, right? So what is the link? But I think let me focus on one particular element here. And, I already spoke to how the sense of existential crisis that is related to the border. Why is this a challenge to democracy? Why is this a crisis to democracy? Because you could say, if the parties get together and come up with a different kind of border policy, this issue can be solved. But think again what's happening at the moment in the US, where there has been a bipartisan suggestion of what to do about the amount of people crossing the border into the US. But Donald Trump has very strategically denied, this option to go through because he needs the border not so much for rational policy making, but a reference point in describing the current state of democracy as one of existential threat and volatility. And, once you establish this sense of we are fundamentally threatened by outside forces, we need to do something dramatic. We need to, in a way, suspend also some of the legal framework, the independence of the courts. When, for example, refugee claimants make claims, we need to suspend also parliamentary proceedings. We need a strong force of someone who has the authority, the proper authority to protect the nation. You can detect this kind of rhetoric quite frequently in those who challenge liberal democracy, the rights-based, procedurally based liberal democracy in the name of defending the right and the will of the people. Populism is the notion that you speak directly, have the voice of the people. And what it suggests indirectly is we need different procedures to deal with this existential crisis. We need an authoritarian leader rather than debating parties to deal with this, right? So I think there is an affinity between this sense of blaming immigrants for the ills of society, the kind of underlying nativism of this ideology, and the plea for a democracy that is not so much rules-based, not so much based on fundamental rights, but by the unlimited authority of a leader to act on behalf of the people. Right? And so I think that is, on a very general level, but an important one, the link between issues of borders and migration and the state of democracy.
Thank you, Oliver. It was not an easy question. And by comparing the US example and the United European example, I think the border studies have shown that state governments must be able to regulate opening and closing mechanisms at the same time. And as you have spoken about that, there is an increasingly strong protectionist discourse and against the free movement of people. And this protectionist discourse is mixed with the nationalist discourse. So in a nutshell, we have understood that the topics of borders and migrations are linked to what some call the crisis of democracy. 2,500 years ago, Cleisthenes brought the demos into political institutions. To identify a demos, Oliver, it is necessary to be able to delimit either spatially or politically or both these demos. There are, in fact, several demos on the geographical and political level. How can we define and delimit a demos, the demos? What are the indicators, Oliver?
Mm-hmm. This is a fascinating question for those who study democracy, right? Because this is the foundation on which democracy is built. Demos is, the people, that collectively decide in a democratically justified way. But what are the proper limits and the borders of this? And, what we've come in a way to do is the coincidence of, and, the historical the result of a long process. Nation states demarcate this demos now. We speak about French democracy, Italian democracy, and so forth, right? For good reasons, to a certain degree. It was the proper size of the political community. But when we think about the current state of democracy, there is, you could argue that we need a different and a more complex way of thinking about the demos, right? Who should be able to vote? Think very concretely. If we have so many immigrants in crossing international borders, should we keep them from voting, let's say, in local elections? In Canada, unless you're a Canadian citizen, you can't really vote in local election. In the European Union, you do have the right after a certain time of residency in a country to participate in the democratic decision-making process at the local level, right? So here you see this already becomes a more diverse understanding and a multi-layered understanding of what the demos is. And I think there is a clear sense of frustration with a demos that is exclusively defined in national terms and restricted to going to the polls every 4 years and feeling quite estranged and in a way disengaged from the democratic process. So thinking creatively about the demos might be a way forward to address the crisis of democracy. On the other hand, you have those forces who say only the nation state is a proper way to think about the demos, that wants us to really restrict us in all other forms of democratic participation, or think about the supranational one at the European level, the European Parliament. So the sense that the demos can be described more in terms of proper investment and commitment to the community, that is being undermined by a highly simplified and oversimplified sense of the nation state and national community as the sole and exclusively relevant way of defining who we are as a political community. So we really see currently a struggle, right? Between those who want to think creatively about what the extent and the nature of the demos is, and those who say, no, it's very rigid. It's only the nation state. And we need to strengthen the borders to protect this demos that is under threat. And then the whole criticism of multiculturalism, right? That the right-wing populist diagnosis of the crisis of democracy is, oh, no, there's too much diversity. We have seen too much immigration, and we no longer have the homogeneity to make democracy work, right? That is, just a couple of weeks back, a scandal in Germany where right-wing intellectuals and the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, they met secretly and thought about re-immigration, they call it, to basically deport 2.5 million people, also citizens from Germany who have a migrant background. Right? So that is a sense, for them, democracy is all about the homogeneous people that are defined by cultural, ethnic, blood relationship, right? A very different vision of democracy than one that said, if you're invested in the political community, do you live there? You have rights as someone who's resident in this community. How do we organize participation? You can see two very, much opposed visions of democracy and what the demos is.
Thank you, Oliver. I saw in one newspaper a map of Europe which represented the degree of satisfaction of the population of the states with their democratic system. This indicated a high satisfaction rate of more than 80% for Luxembourg, Ireland, Sweden, Finland, then a rate of 75% for Germany, then much lower average rates for France, Poland, Spain, and Italy. What is happening in Europe, Oliver? Can we see a new political geography of political discontent taking shape in real time? And what does this mean for the future of Europe and the European Union?
Ben, you definitely have a talent for asking the challenging and the broad questions about political development. But you're definitely right. There is a real sense of crisis in democracy. And if you continued looking at those numbers, you would go to, I think, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, where the satisfaction with democracy is around 30%. So that is a real sense of skepticism amongst the citizens in terms of the vitality and the desirability of democratic. And I think there's a complex reason for dissatisfaction. I think it was be oversimplified simply to blame those who now consider from a right-wing populist perspective a different kind of democracy. I think that their rise indicates a true crisis of democratic rule in many Western liberal democracies. And Peter Mayer, some years ago, he spoke about the hollowing out of democracy, that basically we're left with a pretty empty institutional shell of decision-making processes, and people feel quite alienated from political parties, from the voting process and all of this. And we see this. The level of engagement seems to be in decline. The trust in political institutions is no longer as robust as it used to be. The permissive consensus that we had in Europe, that democracy, liberal democracy is best we have, and we should be happy with it. You might still recall, and some of the slightly older listeners might still recall the optimism in the 1990s after the collapse of communism. We would all live in liberal democracies, the only remaining form of governments that is legitimate and effective. That has changed, maybe also in light of the manifold crises that we have, right? We had the 2008 financial crisis, a great degree of financial, economic insecurity. We have rising inequalities as a result of globalization. We have the climate disasters. We had COVID, right? I think people feel that democratically elected governments no longer have the proper responses and the effective tools to deal with all those challenges that we have in liberal democracy. And the one reaction is to ask for more authoritarian rule. There's also surveys, not only the satisfaction that you cite, but how many people are willing to consider as a form of governance, authoritarian rule, military rule, rule by experts. And you see quite a rise in the percentage of those who say, why not, right? Liberal democracy is so weak, so ineffective. And that's also the rhetoric of authoritarian regimes like Russia and China, who say, look, your liberal democracy, you can't get your act together. So there is this real sense, and in this void, the lack of trust in democratic rule, entrepreneurs who say, we have the simple solutions, right? We know what to do. We just rely on the nation state, strong national identity. We close the borders. We protect ourselves from immigrants, and that will be the solutions. I think it's pretty clear that what they have to offer won't increase the prosperity, freedom, or the well-being of the citizens, but it is a remarkably effective and, in a way, seductive narrative that they have, right? To say all these crises could possibly be met and addressed with closing the borders.
Thank you, Oliver. In February 2024, so very recently, the European Commission said that Viktor Orban's government has violated EU law and the principle of democracy. And it's my transition with the current called Nativism. Mm-hmm. It is an ideology which postulates that the nation state, and you spoke a little bit about that, must be inhabited only by the same nationals. How does this movement, in a few words, threaten democracy of the EU?
It is it's hard to imagine, what this would mean really. Think about the big nation state in Europe. Think about France, Germany. I think in Germany, it's almost a third of the people have some kind of migration background, right? So what would pleading for homogeneity actually mean? The kind of nativism. Mm-hmm. It is a very forceful political ideology, that's for sure. But what we see is clearly also, and it is not by accident that this nativist idea about defining political community exclusively based on ethnic, cultural markers, that this also has a devastating effect on democratic rule. It is not by accident, because then you could say the leader is only there to protect national identity, national sovereignty, right? And for this, we don't need all these parties. We don't need parliamentary debate. We don't need a free press or the European Union, for this matter, to impose its liberal laws. All we need is a force to protect the sovereign rights of the people. That's the rhetoric, right? And you can see how there is this close connection, to more authoritarian options when it comes to expressing what the will of the people is. It's, as we know from history, that's, what fascist regimes in the 1920s and 30s, they explored, right? So all this change, the economic crisis, and we offer you something where you have a strong leader expressing the will of the people directly through acclamation, not through parliamentary debates and so forth, right? And so I think there's this real threat. At the same time, I don't want to be too pessimistic here. You also see those who go out in the streets and demonstrate exactly against this kind of vision. In Germany, over the past 3 or 4 weeks, I think it's almost 3 million people all across the country demonstrating for a multicultural, diverse, pro-democracy Germany in light of the challenges that comes from the radical right. So there is also civil society said, no, we don't want this vision of a kind of a nativist ideology that excludes all the outsiders. And you can see boundaries are, very good reference points to see who does belong and who doesn't, right? Who is legitimately here. And this kind of binary, scapegoating others, we versus the others is a powerful tool in politics. But, liberal democracy hasn't been very good in justifying immigration, in seeing this as a positive force. Maybe Canada is somewhat of an exception where you have a broad consensus that multiculturalism, diversity, there's something that bring prosperity and something desirable to the country. That is not the case in most European countries, right? And that is something that, might at least empower those forces that clearly have a more anti-democratic, authoritarian tendency.
Thank you, Oliver, for this brilliant summary of what's going on in Europe and the different threats on democracies there. Let's speak now about the concept of populism. The concept of border is also used by the thinkers of populism. They talk about borders between left and right, but also social borders and political borders between the elites and the people. My question finally concerns the concept of popular sovereignty, and people's sovereignty. Is the concept of popular sovereignty populist by nature? How to think more intelligently about this concept?
It surely has, popular sovereignty has been a very powerful tool for these political forces. They claim to express the will of the people, and they do this by having two forms of binaries, right? On the one hand, you have what we just discussed, us versus them in terms of homogeneity of the people, cultural sense of identity, and the outsiders, right? So culturally coded sense of inclusion and exclusion. And you could easily play, with immigrants as scapegoats. But they also have the additional dimension of the upper class, the establishment, and ordinary people, right? So you basically have these two axes that define the ideology of populist. And they're very savvy in combining these, right? So, for example, they say, our political elites, or for this matter, the elites in Brussels, they impose immigration on us. We don't want this, quote unquote, but here is the elite, it's in their interest, right? And they try to, the most extreme form, say they try to undermine our national identity, right? Who we are as a people. And the identitarian movement is the most extreme form of this. Or they deprive us of our interests, right? Immigrants take all the jobs, they go to get all the welfare state payments and so forth. All the oversimplified and empirically wrong accusations here. But that is, the recipe, and it works with two things. The strong boundaries between us and them, both in terms of other people, different people, immigrants, and the elites. And that is very powerful in politics. So emotionally charged. They deprive us. They take away things that we are entitled to. We were betrayed by the elites. And you can see how this resonates, partly because democracy hasn't been all this great in terms of including people and empowering them in the past decades. So that, and then they construct this notion of we are the saviors of the nation state, right? So that is then when they come in. Ultimate crises, that's why Trump always talks about how America disappears, right? It is being, it falls apart. They need this narrative of fundamental crisis, and then they are the savior by closing the borders and protecting the people. So you can see why this is a very powerful political ideology, and why we will go into the elections to the European Parliament. We might see quite a rise in those political forces who base their attraction in the mistrust in political elites, be it national or at the European level. It's sort of a paradox that they want to be elected into a European Parliament, that of an institution they essentially despise. Yes. But that's a different kind of issue. But you can see here how they want to go back to the bordered Europe, right? They hate the idea of a borderless Europe that was established through the Schengen Agreement, right? All this that has, I think, contributed to the sense of what Europe is, its freedoms over the past decades. You can go from one country to another. Students, being in Erasmus programs, all this has greatly contributed to the sense of an emerging European sense of political community and identity. That's, exactly what they contest.
Thank you, Oliver. I have read in some articles that neoliberalism has been the dominant ideology for 40 years. And this neoliberalism and its austerity would destabilize socioeconomic rights and also threaten democracy itself. We can see a link between the criticism of neoliberalism and the national hardening of territorial or symbolic borders. Oliver, how is it possible to resist the rise of right-wing nationalisms?
You started this question with alluding to globalization. And, if you go back, let's say 2-3 decades, there was this promise that globalization would overcome exactly these national divides, the borders, that would bring prosperity around the world, the great sense of optimism that we would all almost go through kind of a uniform form of governments across the world, the end of history and all this kind of things. Clearly, what we've seen is that neoliberalism on a global scale has also unleashed a destructive form of capitalism, deepening social inequalities, the climate emergency. So the negative effects of globalization become now very clear. And people are aware of this. They say, my life hasn't improved much. Yeah, there's more uncertainty. There's more challenges. We live from one crisis to the other. I think this has shaken the sense of being protected, being well governed by many people in Western liberal democracies. We talked about the crisis of democracy, the fading fate in those in power that they could address these crises effectively. And that is, probably good governments will be the first step towards addressing these concerns and undermining the attractiveness of right-wing populists, who come with these oversimplified solutions. Say it's only one matter of these one or two things that we need to do, right? So all illnesses or, economic crises, they come in through the outside. And that is, I think, for us, a major task, and also to think about what are the driving sources that or factors that make the nativist ideology so attractive. I think that's something that we grapple with in migration scholarship, right? Or thinking about democracy, that, I think a surprise of how fragile and vulnerable our democracy has become, that we can't rely simply on, it's business as usual. I think we're now in a new phase, and globalization has, in a way, led to a situation where this fundamental doubt in the attractiveness of democratic institutions has been, has reached a point where, these new entrepreneurs can come in and promise a different form of governance that is clearly more authoritarian in character, and promises to undermine what globalization has done in terms of making us more international, more diverse, also the freedom to cross borders, right? All those things are on the line, right? So again, I don't want to sound too alarmist, but there is this deep sense of those things that we took for granted, that has accompanied us for decades after the war in Western Europe, North America, a form of liberal rights-based democracy. It's at least being fundamentally challenged.
Thank you, Oliver. We are close to the end of our interview. I have one last question about the multiple types of democracy. And my very last question is about the future of the Center for Global Studies. Philosophers of democracy have explored different modes and types of democracy, democratization, and citizenship. And they have developed concepts like global citizenship, multicultural citizenship, or Gaia democracy, to include the Earth per se and the non-human beings. We have also seen movements to defend the sovereignty of indigenous peoples and indigenous democracies all around the world. Many international borders have cut their traditional and ancestral territories. What is the place of these issues in research on decision-making, democratic governance, and cross-border identities? And can the concept of memory policy, play a beneficial role in certain contexts? With the example of the construction of the European Union post-World War, post-Nazism. What do you think, Oliver?
I think if we look back at the formation of the European Union, first of European Community, it was born out of a realization that extreme form of nationalism are detrimental, both to democracy, the well-being of European citizens, and the stability of the continent. This is a fundamental lesson that we learned after the Second World War and the experience of the Holocaust, the rise of fascist regimes. It's a long time ago now. And for many people, I think this rationale for why the European Union came into being in the first place, create peace, create understanding, create exchange, and maybe work towards a kind of supranational sense of political community in the continent, that this is largely forgotten. I still remember when the European Union was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace some years ago. People were very surprised and say, what are they talking about, right? Yeah, they seem to be more about failure at the moment. But it is, I think, if you look back historically, this is a huge achievement of the European Union on European soil. But the lessons drawn from this, right, they seem to have now been moved into the background. And there's a new generation that is no longer socialized into this sense of how we remember the past and the lessons that we draw from it. And this is, I think, the juncture that we're at. If you think about the Renaissance and the resurgence of nationalist ideologies, a strong sense of, we talked about the desire for more culturally homogeneous people, the entrepreneurs that want to close borders, that think about the political community only in terms of national borders and binary systems of us versus them. They go back to a tradition that has been devastating for the European continent. And I think what we've seen in debates, I alluded to the demonstrations in Germany. That's what I follow quite vividly. It's often about never again is now, remember the past. This but also in Poland, that was interesting. The change in government, the peace government under Kaczynski, in place for multiple years with a notable challenge to democracy. But then it was about different ideas about what democracy is. How do we imagine democracy? And it was about mobilizing the past. On the one hand, those were the very strong said we need to protect the pride of the Polish nation. On the other hand, those who said, no, it is all about developing new freedoms and liberty and democracy and, overcoming the legacy of communist authoritarian rule. So what we see now is with the rise of populist nationalism is a shrinking of the space of reimagining what democracy could be about, right? We also alluded to indigenous cultures and things. I think it would be, if we consider how we can revive the attractiveness of democratic rule, it would be worth thinking creatively about demos, about democratic rights of participation, about what it means to govern the polity, the political community. And I think indigenous communities are a wonderful example of thinking creatively of how, for example, you can govern the commons across territories, across also borders. As often their communities straddle national borders, right? So I think that would be the task to reimagine democratic practices, but it becomes very difficult to do this in an environment in which you have those who say, we have to dispense of and do away with some of those rights-based democratic rights in light of the emergent crisis of the nation state. So I think we see also a clash of visions of what democracy is and the limitations of one that is still very firmly based on, the national community and protecting the house of the nation state in terms also of a collective identity. So practicing and thinking creatively about what democracy could be, how it could straddle different communities, what is the status of citizenship, residency, who has a stake in the community, how could we, do this in more participatory ways? That will be the next step. But, that might be something for the next podcast to discuss.
Thank you, Oliver. We spoke about reimagining democracy, reimagining democratic practices, reimagining the links between migration studies and border studies. Of course, borders are not only a line of separation. They are not a line of separation. They are a zone of cooperation, of integration. And sometimes nationalist parties forgot the idea of the local people who are living at the borders and enjoying to cooperate with each other with the differential created by the borders. It works in some areas in Europe and all around the world.
Could I interrupt you there? I think what you have done in the big project is quite, it's wonderful to see how you studied border regions as, in a way, an area where these practices of democratic rule across borders are being enacted, right, and experimented with. And we've seen quite some fascinating forms of collaboration across borders, redefining political community and dealing with the legacies of extreme nationalism over time. It's hard to get away from those legacies. But I think the focus on borderlands that you've done in the big project has been quite illuminating to think exactly along these creative lines of what democracy could look like in the 21st century.
Yes, thank you, Oliver. Oliver, you have been the director of the Center for Global Studies since 2012, with a strong identity marked by the links between the global and the local, with the serious challenges caused by, for example, the climate destabilization and facing democracies, the challenges facing democracies. How do you see the positioning and the future of the Center for the study, current study, and some future issues, Oliver?
So far, what we've done is to debate scholarship, scholarly traditions, border studies, migration studies related to democracy. But I think it's important to realize that we scholars working at the university, we are part of this environment, and we are dependent on a context in which we do have democratic forms of deliberation, in which we believe in the argument of the better argument, in truth, in objective facts. And we see a lot of pressure on the universities coming from those who say, critical intellectuals, critical debates is something that undermines the authority of those in power. And so when we talk about the crisis of democracy, I think it goes to the very core of what universities are, what they have to contribute to a critical debate. And so I see the center as well critically reflecting on what it means to live in a society that is open to and has the privilege of debating openly, contesting ideas, contesting power. And we see the proliferation of authoritarian regimes around the world. And so I think universities play a critical role. And so if you ask me what could be agendas, it will be, what we discussed, right? The future of democracy, the crisis of democracy, visions of political community, practices of engaging communities in those processes, working with them, thinking about multi-layered form of democracy, from the supranational to the national to the regional to the local. All those themes, I think, are of critical importance to reimagining and imagining our future as citizens and in the political community. So with this, it's a general idea, but I think it's important to realize how integrally related, fundamentally linked a university is to the political environment in which we operate. And so it is a fragile democratic culture that needs defending.
Thank you very much, Oliver, for sharing all your knowledge about migration studies, border studies, and democratic practices. Thank you very much for this intense and deep exchange. Oliver, it was a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you, Ben. And congratulations on your podcast series. It's a great way of getting the word out of the fabulous work you do in the project.
Thank you, Oliver. In this podcast, we were able to realize the complicated and complex links between border studies, migration studies, and political reflections on democracy. This was the Borders in Globalization podcast. Thank you for your attention and see you next month for the next issue. Bye-bye.